Masha will be talking to us for about 40 minutes, and then there will be the opportunity to ask questions after that. So do, while you're listening, think of the kinds of things that you'd like to sort of discuss after the fact. And please, without any further ado, welcome our guest, Masha Gessen.
Thank you. Thank you. Actually, I want to thank you for that introduction, Emily, who has disappeared. I'm really glad that you mentioned the outpouring of writing that has happened in the wake of the election, because of even though I have very little hope, the only thing possibly that gives me hope is that just incredible sort of mobilization of intellect that has happened. And that, to me, feels different than other autocrats I have experienced. And it feels invigorating and fascinating. I think there's a possibility of renewal, sort of intellectual renewal and institutional renewal, especially for the media, that is contained in that writing, and that makes me very, very excited and interested. But to begin with, I actually want to go back to an ancient time about 8 months ago, or 9 months ago, an age of innocence. And what happened to me back then was that I had taken my then 14-year-old daughter to a conference with me, and we were going home. It was a 2-hour drive, and she said, what are you going to do if Trump wins? And I said, I thought what she was asking about was the fact that we had left Russia because of Vladimir Putin and the anti-gay policies of the Kremlin. And so I thought she was asking about that. And I said, well, it's a different situation, and Trump is really frightening, but American institutions are very strong, and it's a whole different framework. So it's not that. I don't think we're necessarily going to have to pick up and leave immediately. She said, yeah, I know all that. Are you going to stop writing about Putin and start doing your job and writing about Trump? And I was humbled, and said, well, I don't know, maybe I'll think about it. So that's what I'm doing, is I'm thinking about it. And I have found over the years that it's much more productive for me as a writer to give public talks about things that I'm still thinking about, rather than books that have already come out. So this talk, in a way, is an invitation to think together about this very frightening and very bizarre and very new situation that we find ourselves in this world after the Trump election. So a lot of what I'm going to be talking about are things that I'm thinking that maybe I will look back on in a month or two and think that they were ridiculous, or you might hear them now and think that they're ridiculous. But the one thing, this talk is about the lessons, Trump's lessons in democracy. And I think I would like to focus on 5 of them. Lesson number 1 for me was a lesson about the imagination. And I've been obsessed with the topic of imagination for much longer than Donald Trump has been running for office. And I think that imagination is a very useful thing to think about when you think about current events and historical events, because I think we have imagination about the future, but we also have imagination about the present and about the past. And how we understand what's happening around us and what has already happened to us and what might happen is a function of our imaginations. And so, for example, when I was writing some years ago about the Russian oil magnate Mikhail Khodorkovsky and how he landed in prison, where he ended up spending 10 years, the more I delved into his story, the more I was convinced that it was a story about a failure of imagination. Because he couldn't, being one of the richest men in the world and the richest man in Russia, he couldn't imagine that he would just suddenly land in jail. And Vladimir Putin, who was looking at him, looking at Khodorkovsky standing up to him, couldn't imagine that after being warned that he might actually get arrested. After being warned that his business would be taken away from him, Khodorkovsky would persist. And so on both sides, there was a failure of the imagination, which resulted in an irresolvable confrontation, which landed Khodorkovsky in prison, where he spent 10 years. And then years later, when I was watching the Brexit referendum in the United Kingdom, I thought it was again a story about the failure of the imagination, where the referendum was called on the very explicit assumption that there is no way that British citizens were going to vote for Brexit. And then they did. And as soon as they did, it was like there was about a 24-hour pause, and then immediately think pieces poured forward talking about how Brexit was actually never going to happen. And the leading argument for how it was never going to happen was that none of the writers could imagine it happening. And I think this is the point that I would like to focus on for this first lesson, which is the way we confuse our own failure of the imagination for the limits of the possible, right? So in the spring of this year, I was having conversations with my friends where after it was clear that Donald Trump had assembled enough delegates to the Republican National Convention to lock in the nomination, and my friends would say, well, it's probably not going to happen. The Republicans are going to probably figure out a way to field another candidate, have a brokered convention, have something or other, or run a Republican candidate as an independent. And what was the argument behind these unlikely scenarios? Invariably, the argument was, I just can't imagine it happening. And the I just can't imagine it happening is actually a phrase that we should begin recognizing as a symptom, right? This is a limitation. This is something that cripples us as humans and as citizens. When we can't imagine something happening, then we reach for things that we can imagine happening, even if they're unlikely, because the obvious suddenly has become unimaginable. Which brings me to my second lesson, and this is a lesson about owning the nightmare. So this is by now, we have gone through being unable to imagine Donald Trump getting the nomination. That takes us from spring of this year to summer, Northern Hemisphere spring to Northern Hemisphere summer, and Donald Trump has been nominated by the Republican Party to run for president. And how is this possible? Suddenly, a theory appears for how this is possible. And the theory, basically, to put it crudely, is that Donald Trump is a Russian agent. Well, you think it's ridiculous, right? I mean, you laugh, and part of the reason you laugh is because of the presentation. But when you read about it in the New York Times, and you read about it in the Washington Post, and the headline of a piece in the Washington Post was "The Siberian Candidate," and the headline of a piece by Paul Krugman, the Nobel laureate in economics, the headline of a piece in the New York Times was "The Manchurian Candidate," which you may recall is a film about a candidate who unwittingly does the bidding of a foreign power, and that was basically the theory, that Donald Trump is doing Putin's bidding. And I think that idea of Donald Trump doing Putin's bidding, and there are all sorts of reasons to think that, right? One reason is that Donald Trump had praised Putin. Donald Trump also had claimed that Putin called him brilliant. This wasn't actually true. But it seemed so believable that it was weeks before anyone fact-checked this. And we'll get to fact-checking in a minute. But I'll do the fact checking for you. So I went to look for when Putin called Donald Trump brilliant. And what I found was a press conference in December 2015 when Putin comes out of his annual press conference. Putin holds one press conference a year. So he comes out of his annual press conference last year, and someone caught him in the doorway and said, "What do you think of Donald Trump?" And there was this momentary pause when it was clear that Putin had no idea who Donald Trump was. And then he said, he's certainly colorful. Now, the word colorful in Russian is a word that, when used on its own, it can also mean bright, but bright as in a bright color. Right? So someone translated it as bright, and then someone else retranslated it. That someone else might actually have been Donald Trump himself. Retranslated it as brilliant, and lo and behold, 6 months after that press conference, a leading American journalist named Fareed Zakaria was in St. Petersburg chairing a panel on which Vladimir Putin was speaking at the St. Petersburg Economic Forum. And Fareed Zakaria asked Putin a question, and the question was lifted directly from Trump's stump speeches. This was before American journalists started taking Trump seriously, which is fascinating. This is June 2016. He already has enough delegates to get the Republican nomination, and they still haven't started fact-checking him. Right? So Fareed Zakaria says, "You have called Donald Trump brilliant. You have called him talented. You have called him a very promising politician." And you can see Putin just going, "What?" And then Putin said, "Well, why do you believe things you hear? And why do you exaggerate?" And then he said, "I called him colorful. He's colorful, isn't he?" So that was one piece of evidence, which I've just sort of debunked, for the Trump-Putin fallacy. Another piece of evidence was this imagined alliance between Putin and Trump. A third was that Trump had said, when asked about NATO, and this was a moment that was very reminiscent of the Putin moment when he's exiting the press conference, because Trump gets asked about NATO, and it had occurred to somebody, one of the journalists covering the campaign, to stop asking Trump about things that he wanted to talk about, and actually ask him about something that had to do with running the United States. So this journalist says, "What do you think about NATO?" And there's that pause, and you can tell that Trump has no idea what he thinks about NATO, because he's never actually thought about NATO. And he said something like, "We just have to figure out whether other countries are paying their dues to NATO, and maybe we're doing too much," which is a perfectly Trumpian answer. Trump is a businessman who has a record of believing himself to be jilted, and thereby believing himself to have the right to stiff everyone else. Right? There was an endless parade. When journalists finally started covering Trump, there was an endless parade of vendors who had been stiffed by Trump. Somebody an architect who designed a golf course for him, a piano vendor who had supplied pianos to him. All these people who hadn't been paid. And if Trump had felt compelled to justify why he hadn't paid them, I'm sure he would have told somebody that they had cheated him first. So from that, and then the final piece of supposed evidence was this very thinly imagined idea that Trump's campaign manager at the time was Paul Manafort, who had worked for the Ukrainian president, who was at one point believed to be pro-Russian, so maybe he was actually working for Putin. That sort of circuitous reasoning. And then there was another guy whom Trump had named as his foreign policy advisor, who had a business in Russia. And then when someone actually looked into it, it turned out that the guy had nothing to do with the Trump campaign. Trump had just picked him off a list when he was asked if he had a foreign policy advisor. So that was basically the sum total of evidence for the idea that Trump was a Russian agent. But the impetus behind this very shoddy argument was, I think, is much more important than the argument itself. And that impetus is to other Trump, to pretend that he's not an American phenomenon. And the way I sort of imagine it is that, I don't mean to say that Russia doesn't do anything to interfere in other countries' election. It does what it can, right? Russia most certainly hacked the Democratic National Committee and leaked the information that was obtained. This was done before Donald Trump was the likely nominee, and it was a classic Russian disruption tactic. And so the way I imagine it is that Trump is a teenager who's built a bomb in his parents' house and has set it off. And the house is falling apart all around the parents, and the parents are blaming the neighbor kid who threw a pebble in the window. And the pebble was there, and it was thrown, but that's not what's bringing the house down. But a result of this attempt to other Trump, to pretend that he is not of America, is weirdly an ability to also normalize him. Because if he's so strange, if he's sort of an otherworldly creature, then you can invite him to a talk show and tussle his hair. And this is literally something that happened on one of the most watched talk shows in America. Because suddenly he becomes abstracted enough, different enough, that you don't see him as a native threat to what America is, right? He's just this sort of scary floating thing. And the other thing, and this brings me to my third lesson, the other thing that this idea of Trump as a foreign agent feeds into is conspiracy thinking. Conspiracy thinking is probably one of the scariest things that I have had to cover as a journalist and watch as a person and read about as somebody who writes about history. Conspiracy thinking is what brings countries to ruin. It's what destroys the public sphere. And the conspiracy thinking took hold during the campaign. Both sides engaged in it. Trump basically kept saying that the entire, and this was the sort of classic populist conspiracy thinking, the elites have conspired against the people. The elites have coddled the enemies of the people. They have coddled the immigrants, they have coddled the terrorists, they have created all sorts of policies that are terrible to you, the voter. And then the other side responds with conspiracy thinking of its own. And this now takes us into August, when Hillary Clinton begins releasing these ads that feed into the Trump as a Russian agent idea. So there's this really creepy ad that contained a lot of footage of Trump talking about Putin, then a Trump advisor having dinner with Putin, which is true. Mike Flynn, who's now the National Security Advisor, the designate, who's a retired general, attended a dinner in Moscow in December 2015. Another person at that very same table was actually Green Party candidate Jill Stein. But the Clinton campaign didn't focus on her, focused on Flynn. And then it ended with the tagline, I can't reproduce it exactly, but it was sort of, we're not telling you what to think for yourself. Draw your own conclusions. Very, very sort of conspiracy thinking kind of style. And to my absolute horror, we're also seeing the same things now as a reaction to the election results. And it began as people began talking about the election results on the night of the election. The Russians did it. The Russians hacked the electoral system. There had been rumors of this before the election. All the people I have interviewed about this all the people that many other journalists have interviewed about this say that basically the project of hacking the U.S. general election is more or less impossible. It's a state-run, the election system is run by states. Most of the electoral system is not actually online to be hacked, which may or may not be a good thing in general, sort of in appraising the technological state of American elections, but it's a pretty good hedge against hacking. And basically, in order to be able to hack the American election, you'd have to hack it county by county in every swing state, in the hope of throwing the election. And not only county by county, but pretty much precinct by precinct. In some precincts, it's possible to hack into the actual voting system, but then the way the results from that precinct get communicated to the county authorities and get communicated to the state authorities, and is generally offline and unhackable, right? And yet, we see people on the left and as part of the Democratic Party starting to float this idea that the election was hacked. And this was one of the arguments used for the recount effort that is now underway in either 2 or 3, depending on who you listen to, American states, which I actually think is tragic. It's tragic because it's a distraction from what's going on, which is that Donald Trump is about to be confirmed by the Electoral College and soon to be inaugurated. And it's also the one horrible thing that didn't happen because Donald Trump won, was a concerted campaign to undermine faith in the American voting system. So that's now happening. It was like the one thing that we were spared in this nightmare. But the larger problem, and of which this is a very, very big symptom, is this problem of conspiracy thinking taking hold in the public sphere. And the debate devolving into a debate not about facts and not about truth, but about belief systems, right? Where you have one side saying, we believe this, facts be damned, and the other side saying, but we believe this, and facts be damned. And that is a terrible way of doing politics, and a way that basically leads to autocracy, which we're now staring in the face. And that gets me to lesson number 4, which is see the bigger picture. I think that part of the reason that conspiracy thinking has gained so much traction, it has to do with the failure of the imagination. It has to do with being in a new situation where reverting to conspiracy thinking is very useful. But it also has to do with the failure of American media to cover the election in a way that would be comprehensive and comprehensible. And here I'm going to borrow a metaphor from Garry Kasparov, the Russian chess player, who, when he first went up, he quit playing chess in 2004, and he went into politics full time. And when he would talk about going into politics, he would say, it's like playing chess against somebody who keeps knocking the figures off the chessboard. You have to understand that he's not following the same rules. And I found that a very useful way of analyzing media coverage in the US around the election, because election coverage is generally very much like sports coverage. Debates are covered like sports, conventions are covered like sports, primaries are covered like sports are. Now, the assumption in sports is that everybody is following the same rules over and over again, that each game is a variation on the previous game. It's a terrible assumption to make about something that only happens once every 4 years and is actually a singularity, right? But But it's also the way that it played out in this campaign was that journalists would say, so, Hillary opened E2, E4, and Trump knocked the figures off the chessboard. And they would say, then he knocked the bishop off the chessboard, and he knocked the knight off the chessboard. And then they would go into an explanation of how the knight moves, instead of saying he's not playing chess. This is something else. And the failure to say that this is something else actually probably or possibly cost Hillary Clinton the election. Now, I'm not saying that the media are responsible for election outcomes. The media are responsible for doing their job, which they didn't, right? But the reason that the media kept reporting, the mainstream media kept reporting that Hillary Clinton was going to win was that they were looking at their own polls and at independent polls, all of which are based on the very same sports model of looking at elections, right? They collect poll data, and then they apply algorithms to it that look at likely voters, look at previous voting patterns, and figure that the exact same thing is going to happen as 4 years ago, with adjustments for how many people support this or that candidate. And that's, you can't do that with elections. Elections aren't chess games. They do not follow the same rules over and over again. They're not played according to the same patterns. They happen once every 4 years. And in a way, it's a miracle that this hasn't happened before, that an election hasn't been so poorly predicted in the United States as this one was. Now, I'm not trying to say that anybody was right. There's a great temptation for me to say, because I was predicting that Donald Trump was going to win going back to July. But this election was actually decided by 107,000 people in 3 different counties in 3 different states. So nobody knew what was going to happen, right? My own imagination was based on what I had seen. And I had seen things always go in the worst possible ways for so many years that I was happy to imagine Trump, or not happy, but capable of imagining Trump happening. And I think that's not the experience of most Americans, and thank God for that. Most Americans, or most American journalists, believe that things will actually always sort of work out, and we'll get to that idea of American exceptionalism in a minute. But what has happened since the election overturned everybody's expectations, and going into the election, the New York Times was giving Hillary something like a 95% chance of winning, right? And the New York Times, I happen to know, didn't have a contingency plan for losing. And this is such an extraordinary thing to me. When I was a young journalist, I actually I made a horrible mistake once. I was working at this magazine, and I was in charge of writing news notes based on press releases. Right? So I wrote this news note and put it on the board. This was back in the old times when things were in paper. And my editor came around and said, "You can't do that. This event is tomorrow. You can't write that it happened." I'm like, "Well, if there's a press release, it's going to happen. The magazine comes out the day after it happened." He said, "No, there might be a fire, there might be a flood, there might be an earthquake. Someone might get into an accident. You can't say that something has already happened unless you're certain it already has." Someone at a very tiny magazine in the States taught me that, 30 plus years ago. The New York Times, the biggest newspaper in the United States, with the best journalists, clearly hadn't been taught that lesson. They had a whole package prepared on the first woman president of the United States, and not a clue as to what they were going to do if it didn't materialize. The same thing happened to many other publications. Slate magazine has been public about the fact that happened to them as well, that they had this whole plan for how they were going to cover Hillary Clinton's victory, and no idea, no contingency plan. And so while once the election upset their expectations, a lot of people threw themselves into sort of this chest beating ritual of drawing lessons. And these lessons have often had to do with how the Democrats have ignored the white working class and how we haven't had enough empathy with the Trump voters. I actually think those are terrible lessons to draw. I think that sort of the white working class fallacy is, the narrative is a really, it's a fallacy of a narrative, basically, that has a way of making an imaginary Trump voter so central to the story that every other voter in the country, and most of those voters aren't white and or aren't white working class. It's another excuse for basically talking about what journalists are most comfortable talking about when they're not talking about themselves. And the other is this empathy narrative. And as a journalist, I'm very sympathetic to the empathy narrative, and I've written books and been criticized for writing books that are based on trying to exercise empathy with people who are really not sympathetic, like my book about the Boston bombers. And yet, I don't think that those are the big lessons of the 2016 campaign. I think that we really need to look at what's happened to the way Americans view the political system over the course of the last 16 years. And that means looking at the American election of the year 2000, when, for the first time in living memory, the candidate who got more popular votes lost, and that was Albert Gore. And of course, the fact that that election was undecided for 2 months, and that the Supreme Court had to step in to declare the winner, and that later it turned out that there was this great focus, and there's actually a very good movie called The Election, if you've never seen it, about the hanging chads, which are these little pieces of paper that the voting machines in Florida are based on punching a hole in the ballot, and sometimes the hole wouldn't go all the way through, and so these little round pieces of paper would hang there and skew the result. So the hanging Chad story captured the imagination for a while, and I think that as a country, America hasn't talked about what a huge blow that was to faith in the electoral system. Then there's 9/11, which is when the current mobilization of America began, and it hasn't stopped, and we haven't faced up to the fact that it hasn't stopped. And a mobilized country, a country that believes itself to be at war and that is at war. I mean, this is the longest war in American history that's been going on since the United States invaded Afghanistan. A country at war is very easy to throw into a fit of conspiracy thinking. A country at war is primed for autocracy. And we haven't talked about that. And the financial crisis of 2008, which caused the unthinkable, the loss of not only their homes for a lot of Americans, but also the loss of any understanding of what the future was going to look like. And if you go back to read people who, the mid-20th century thinkers who were writing about the rise of Nazism in Germany, they wrote in great detail about this loss of an idea for the future, about the unbearable anxiety that people who don't know what their lives are going to look like experience. And what's happened in the States was that sort of an acknowledgement of the fact that the unthinkable has happened has never occurred. And then finally, there's been an unprecedented concentration of power in the executive branch, beginning with 9/11 under Bush and continuing under Obama, Continuing on under Obama for some of the same reasons and some different reasons, which is that he faced a recalcitrant Congress that basically blocked everything that he tried to do, and so he began ruling by executive decree, by executive order. And that's not just a problem of governance, it's also a problem of public perception. And Americans have begun to see the president in a very different way than even 15, 20 years ago. So it made it possible for Donald Trump to run for autocrat while Hillary Clinton was running for president. And in that contest, people voted for the person running for autocrat. And that brings me to the final lesson of Donald Trump and American democracy, which is the lesson of taking exception to American exceptionalism. Americans believe that everything will be okay. Americans believe that they have devised the best system in the world. And it is so brilliant and so wonderful that there's no reason to redesign it or revisit it or re-examine it. That's a really widely held belief across the political spectrum. And Americans believe that that they are always an exception to what's happening in the rest of the world. Very few people in the United States know that before World War II, as fascist movements arose in Europe, fascist movements rose in the United States as well. That's the part of American history that's really forgotten. And when for example, a journalist named John Judas, who writes about global populism, was writing a quick book that's written in a couple of months and published soon after on populism for a publisher called Columbia Global Reports, which is a really great publisher. He wanted to include the United States in the book. This is last summer he's writing the book. And his publisher didn't want him to include the United States because, of course, populism is rising all over the world, but not in America. Well, surprise. It's been fascinating and disheartening to watch that there was a fleeting moment, maybe a week, maybe 2 weeks after the election, that American intellectuals said, oh my God, what do you guys do when you elect an autocrat? We need some lessons from Russia, from Italy, from all these other places, because we seem to have fallen into the same boat. That period is over because the tragedy that has engulfed the American imagination is now so huge that, from what I can tell, there's been like this very quick 360-degree dance move that American media have performed, where they took interest in the rest of the world for just about 1 second, and then said, "Oh my God! But what's happening here is so much worse than anything that's ever happened anywhere else." And once again, we're completely unique. This is solipsistic, like some other things I've said, because I'm looking at reactions to sort of my writing and my negotiations on what I'm planning to write, and I'm seeing that sort of from the American publishing world that sort of okay, we've heard enough about the rest of the world. Now let's focus on what's happening here, because this is the biggest tragedy to ever befall any people in the history of the universe, which is not true. But it may be the biggest tragedy to befall the universe as a whole, because of course now what we're witnessing is not, is not a Russian agent who is the president-elect, but a vengeful little bully with no knowledge. And I'm going to claim one more before I stop. One more I told you so moment. Back when I wrote my biography of Putin, it's largely a book about somebody who is unremarkable in every way, becoming the accidental president of a nuclear power. And then the book was very successful and it got a lot of good reviews, but most of the time the reviewer would then pause and say, but not the business about mediocrity. Because nobody who's like that stupid actually becomes president of a great power. Well, yes. The really terrible news for the world is that there are now two of them. And they're both within a hair's breadth of the nuclear button, and one is not the other's agent. And they're not going to be friends. And they are going to be two vengeful men with very little knowledge, very little understanding of the world, very big egos, and very short tempers. And on that hopeful note, I'm going to take questions. Thank you. Thank you. So I think there are mics in the audience. Yeah. Could we bring the lights up just a little bit? Thank you. Hands? Yes.
Hi. My question is, so obviously President Trump is going to have all sorts of impacts on the world stage, which will eventually affect us here in Bendigo. But on a more immediate level, when you're talking about the election of Trump, something that's already happened, what kind of impacts might that have in places such as Bendigo in terms of the way that people act in the public sphere, or any other sort of immediate impacts from the election itself?
Right. Oh, it's a great question. I'm not an expert on Bendigo, but I think that if I understand your question correctly, I would focus on the damage that that he's doing to the public sphere, and it's not just the American public sphere, because the American public sphere influences the entire world, and particularly the English-speaking world. And I know that Australia has had its own issues with the public sphere and with language. And I guess maybe it's because I'm a writer, but I'm really language is one of my huge worries, because I think that when we lose language, and by that I mean when we lose the ability to use language in ways that advance our understanding of ourselves and our vision of the future, then we lose the ability to create good. I'm worried that that covering Trump and living with Trump as a world leader poses those kinds of issues in two ways. One is just sort of the straightforward abuse and misuse of language, when something is called something that it isn't, and part of it is necessitated by, or part of it is facilitated by the media, who are reacting to things that are happening. Because on the one hand, you feel like you can't always be calling something out as a lie, or an absolute horror, and so you slowly begin to normalize what's happening. And some examples of that are, the recent article in the New York Times that called his pick for environmental secretary a climate contrarian, as opposed to a climate denialist. And these are subtle shifts, but it's not terribly subtle for we're just 3 weeks in. 4 weeks of that kind of sliding, and we're going to end up, on the other side of the spectrum. Another thing that happens is that as sort of the center begins to shift, and so things that weren't marked before because they were normal become marked, and things that weren't normal become normal and therefore unmarked. And what I mean by that is, when journalists write, they will describe something that is not normal. An example is a couple of weeks ago there was an awards evening in New York. The National Book Awards was awarded. And I was there, and it was an amazing evening. It was 1 week after the election, so all these publishing people come together. It's the biggest party of the publishing world of the year, and it felt almost transcendent. It was mobilizing. People talked about what was really important. It felt like those awards weren't just awards for for things that people had done well and for good books, but they were like calls to action. It was really awesome. And the article in the New York Times had this framing sentence that said, many in the liberal-leaning publishing world were stunned and disheartened by the election results. Now, liberal-leaning is a way of marking, right? And it tells you the people who were stunned and disheartened aren't the normal. The normal are the ones who accept it as something that you would expect. And it's such a subtle thing. But unless you know what to focus on, it starts happening to you, and you get inured to it. So I'm sorry, this is such a long answer, but I'm obsessed with this. And the other thing is that it's just the post fact or no fact reality of just use any words to mean anything. And the point of that, and I think this is part of what I was talking about, sort of in the chess metaphor, where the fact checking went so horribly wrong, is that the point of that is not to lie exactly. It is to claim the right to say whatever the hell I please, which is a way of expressing power. And when you divorce language from meaning, because it only serves the purpose of expressing power, then I don't know how languages can later be reclaimed. Do we have somebody on this side, or no? Okay, let's go over here.
Thank you very much indeed for your presentation. It's been fantastic. On the night that the election results were announced, I heard Clementine Ford speak, who is quite a well-known Australian feminist, and she was not very hopeful. I'd love to hear your thoughts on the impact on women in America and across the world as a result of Donald Trump becoming elected.
Right. Well, where do I begin? We've just elected an outspoken misogynist, a clear, documented sexual assaulter to the presidency, talking about the fact that he has said he will repeal Roe v. Wade, the Supreme Court decision that guarantees the right, kind of sort of guarantees the right to abortion, is almost secondary to just this huge, horrifying leap toward normalization of the hatred of women and violence against women, and the use of all kinds of language about women. So, and also here there's no way to get around the tragedy. In talking about this, part of the impact of his victory is also the impact of Hillary's loss. Because here's what happens to a woman who is by far the most qualified person to have ever run for president of the United States, who, I think there were issues with her campaign, not the issues that most people say are the issues with her campaign, but she was a great candidate, and she would have been a great president, and she would have become president if she had been a man. I have no doubt about it. Her biggest flaw as a candidate was that she was female. And the tragedy of seeing that, the tragedy of, the incredible symbolism of her having rented this glass structure in New York City for her victory party to show that she had shattered the glass ceiling, and then not coming and not giving a speech. because the ceiling hasn't been shattered. I mean, it is the most powerful symbol of how far we have been set back. Yes.
Thank you very much for your talk. But I wanted to ask, what do you think the influence of media moguls like Rupert Murdoch have been in this campaign?
Right. So I don't think Murdoch actually played. I mean, in the U.S., Murdoch himself didn't play a huge role. He owns media in the U.S., and most notably, he owns the Wall Street Journal. The Wall Street Journal was very good. I'm no longer intimately familiar with the workings of the Wall Street Journal, but I think they did actually a very good job of covering the campaign, and some of their editorial pieces were very insightful and took the conversation further than I think some other media. But there were other media that were very influential, in specifically Breitbart, which went from being a right-wing website that a lot of liberal Americans had never heard of, to being the dominant media outlet in the United States. And this is something that I'm used to seeing. I've seen it in a lot of countries, but the United States hasn't faced this before. It has not seen a media mogul in the White House before. But that's exactly what we're seeing. We're seeing Steve Bannon, who is Trump's advisor, is also the CEO of Breitbart News. BuzzFeed did a terrific thing today. They analyzed all of Donald Trump's tweets since the beginning of the campaign to see this is a great question to ask, and it's so brilliant that they thought to ask it. What's his news source? And so it looks, and then they came up with this diagram of the sources that he seems to be getting his news from, and it's clear that Breitbart is by far the dominant news source that he's getting news from. So this is the beginning of the perfect autocrat media scheme, where Vladimir Putin has been watching his own television for 16 years, and that is one of the biggest factors of what Russia is. Right? Donald Trump hasn't come to dominate American media in the way that Putin dominates Russian media, but he is already watching Trump TV and getting his understanding of what's happening from Trump TV, and that's a perfect sort of self-perpetuating system. So that's what I would be looking at more than a Murdoch figure. Yes. And then we'll take one more, and then we'll have to stop.
There are hopeful souls in the commentariat who look to the US Congress and to the executive as operating in some sort of moderating influence on Trump's presidency. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, so there's this lovely scenario that Trump will be impeached, and for conflict of interest, and then we'll get Mike Pence, who will just be like your ordinary far right president, which would be great. It would be a lot better than Trump. Seriously, I'm not one of those Pence is worse than Trump people, because I think that a far right-wing politician who is basically committed to the conventions of American political culture and norms and institutions is so superior to Donald Trump, who is dead set on destroying American political norms, right? But I don't see that happening. I think that's down with the Republicans are going to do something to broker the convention. He's got a Republican Congress, a Republican Senate, a vacancy in the Supreme Court, 85 vacancies in federal courts, a majority of Republicans in the state houses around the country, and he seems to be lazy enough and distracted enough to be hands-off. So he's going to give Pence carte blanche in terms of policy, while he gets down to the business of destroying political culture. That seems to be, judging from the cabinet appointments so far, that's the division of labor. There's no motivation to be found there for Republicans to impeach him, and it would have to be Republicans. So I just don't see that happening, and I don't see a moderating influence, because I think they're going to basically agree to do these, to pursue these two separate projects. So I think we're running over, but can we take one more question? Yeah? Okay, so there's one up here. No, we have to. You have to get the mic.
I think you've probably already addressed quite a few of what I was going to ask you, but in the short term, what are some of your imaginings, say, of Trump in the next year or so? I mean, as I say, you elucidated to the other questions, but
Right.
So you can get them out now.
Yeah. So yeah, I shouldn't have taken that question. I don't. You know, I think that journalists should never be in the business of predicting. I think that journalists are in the business of saying what is and what's wrong with what is. That's really our job. But
what about you? Your first lesson was imagining.
right, you're right. But so I can. Okay, you see, I really shouldn't have taken this question, but you're totally right.
No, about 10 years longer than you, so I know.
Right.
Not as smart as you, though.
Thank you. So I'll tell you what I'm really worried about. What I'm really worried about is that Trump is the kind of leader who is obsessed with his popularity and who has a very primitive idea of what political power is. He thinks that political power is control, and political power is measured by popularity. He's coming in, even though he has more political power than any incoming president in living memory, right? Because he has, complete party dominance over the country. He's still coming in feeling deeply insecure because he got the minority of the vote. It's a horrible setup for someone with that temperament. So I think he's going to look for ways to whip up popularity. The way for somebody with his autocratic tendencies to whip up popularity is war. It can be war abroad or it can be war at home. He's not particularly interested in abroad. I think that he's likely to sort of to fumble. I mean, he's already fumbling with sort of foreign relations, and I can't imagine. I can't imagine, right? So that's a limitation. It doesn't mean it's not going to happen, but I can't imagine him being particularly aggressive abroad in the short term. But I can imagine him unleashing wars at home. So that's immigrants, that's Muslims, that's conflicts with local governments that refuse to go along with his attack on immigrants. For example, New York City has already said that it will not allow, it will continue to be a sanctuary city, it will not allow its police to be used to round up deportees. It will not allow, if there's a Muslim registry, it will not allow it to be, to actually be done in New York City. I can see that conflict really getting whipped up, because New York, nothing exemplifies the liberal elite like New York City does. And it doesn't matter that Trump lives there and plans to continue to live there even when he's supposed to move into the White House, because that kind of doublethink has never stopped an autocrat. So I see that happening. I think that there's probably going to be a major rollback on LGBT rights, simply because that's the most recent and most rapid cultural change in the United States. So it's a very gratifying thing to call out to. It's instantly recognizable as sort of going back to an imaginary past when we were more comfortable. So he has already pledged to sign legislation, so-called religious freedom legislation, that basically will allow discrimination on against LGBT people in public accommodation and hospitals and that sort of thing. So I think we're going to be seeing, a new wave of homophobic legislation and policies without you don't have to revoke marriage to do that. You can reverse cultural change without reversing legal change, which is going to be a new lesson for the LGBT community. So, on that hopeful note, thank you.
Visit wheelercentre.com for the best in books, writing and ideas from Melbourne, Australia and the world.